Sweetheart, he's Sicilian, not confused. Just bring the wine. The laughter came first, soft and polished, the kind rich people use when they want cruelty to sound like manners. Then Maya Brooks lifted her eyes, looked past the diamond watches, the hand-tailored tuxedos, the champagne flutes glowing under amber light, and spoke one sentence to the old man in a language almost everyone in that room had forgotten existed. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Forks stopped above plates of handmade ravioli. A waiter froze beside the carved oak doors. Someone's phone slipped halfway out of their hand and hovered there, forgotten. Even the string quartet near the marble fireplace seemed to lose its rhythm, one violin note trembling in the air before disappearing into the gold-paneled walls of Bellafere, the most exclusive Italian restaurant in Lower Manhattan. At the head of the long private table sat Adrian Whitmore, billionaire CEO of Whitmore Capital, a man whose face had been on magazine covers, financial networks, airport billboards, and conference screens from New York to Singapore. He was 38, white, sharp-jawed, calm in the way men are calm when the world usually moves for them. Tonight was supposed to belong to him. This dinner was not just a dinner. It was a victory lap. In less than 1 hour, Adrian planned to announce Bellini Tower, a $2 billion luxury hotel project that would replace 6 blocks of what remained of Little Sicily, turning old bakeries, family groceries, cracked stone churches, and rent-stabilized apartments into glass, skyline views, rooftop pools, and suites that started at $900 a night. Around him sat investors, attorneys, city consultants, and people who knew how to smile while erasing entire neighborhoods. Beside him sat Victoria Harlow, his fiancée, elegant, blonde, expensive in every detail, from the ivory dress that never wrinkled to the smile that never reached her eyes. And 3 seats down, slightly apart from the glow of celebration, sat Adrian's father, Salvatore Bellini, 76 years old, Sicilian-born, hands folded over a cane, suit a little too loose at the shoulders, eyes dark and tired, like windows in a house no one visited anymore. Adrian had brought him tonight for symbolism. Heritage looked good in photographs. A father from Sicily made the project seem personal, almost noble. But Salvatore had barely spoken since arriving. He only stared at the restaurant walls, at the black and white photos of immigrant families, at the painted sun above the archway near the kitchen, at the old neighborhood being toasted by people who had never carried groceries up a 6th-floor walk-up or translated rent notices for a parent who could not read English. Moving quietly around the table was Maya Brooks, 24, a shy black waitress with steady hands and a voice most guests had not bothered to hear. She wore a pressed white shirt, a black apron, simple flats, and her name tag slightly crooked because she had fixed it in a hurry after a double shift. To most of the room, she was part of the service, no more memorable than the silverware. But Maya noticed everything. The way Adrian corrected his father's pronunciation under his breath. The way Victoria leaned away when Salvatore spoke with his accent. The way investors smiled at the old man like he was a charming antique instead of a living person. Maya had learned long ago that invisible people see the most. Then Salvatore reached for a glass of water and brushed a folded handkerchief from his lap. It fell near Maya's shoe. White linen, blue stitching, a small golden sun in the corner. Maya bent down, picked it up carefully, and the moment her fingers touched the symbol, something in her face changed. Victoria noticed and gave a small laugh. "Careful, honey," she said, loud enough for the table to hear. "That's probably older than your whole apartment." A few people chuckled. Maya did not answer. She turned to Salvatore, placed the handkerchief gently beside his plate, pressed one hand over her heart, and said softly, "See you portaloo suli dintra, non resta mai sulu." Salvatore stopped breathing for a moment. Adrian's smile vanished. Victoria blinked. Nobody understood the words, but everyone understood the tears filling the old man's eyes. For a few seconds, the richest people in the room had no idea what they were looking at. They knew balance sheets. They knew contracts. They knew how to make a neighborhood disappear behind phrases like urban renewal, market opportunity, and premium redevelopment. But they did not know what to do with an old man crying over a waitress who had spoken to him like family. Salvatore Bellini lifted one trembling hand toward Maya, not to summon her, not to command her, but to steady himself against the sudden weight of memory. His eyes stayed on her face as if he were afraid that if he looked away, the voice he had just heard would vanish. Adrian sat frozen at the head of the table, his fingers still wrapped around the stem of his wine glass. He had seen his father emotional before, but only in private moments, behind closed apartment doors, beside old photographs. During Sunday calls he often ended too quickly. Never here. Never in front of investors. Never in a room worth more per square foot than the bakery where Salvatore had once worked before sunrise. Victoria's smile thinned. She glanced around, trying to read the room, trying to decide whether this was embarrassing or useful. That was the difference between her and Maya. Maya saw a man. Victoria saw a moment to manage. Before anyone spoke, Salvatore whispered something back in Sicilian, his voice rough, almost broken by disbelief. Maya lowered her eyes respectfully, then answered. Not loudly, not proudly, just clearly. The sound moved across the table like a candle being carried through a dark hallway. One of the attorneys leaned toward another and whispered, "Is that Italian?" The other shook his head. He did not know. None of them knew. They had spent the evening celebrating an Italian-themed luxury project without understanding the language that lived underneath the theme. Bellafiore itself seemed to hold its breath. The restaurant had been built inside a restored brick building on Mulberry Street, with arched windows, hand-painted tiles, and old family portraits arranged along the walls like quiet witnesses. The investors had praised the authenticity of it all when they arrived. They had loved the rustic bread, the imported olive oil, the faded photographs of dock workers and seamstresses and boys in wool caps standing beside pushcarts. But authenticity was easier to admire when it did not ask for rent protection, preservation rights, or respect. Maya knew that better than most. She had been working at Bellafiore for 8 months, long enough to learn which guests said please and which ones only pointed. Long enough to know that expensive rooms could still be small in spirit. She was shy, yes, but shyness was not emptiness. It was not ignorance. It was the quiet armor she had built after years of being underestimated by people who mistook volume for value. She had grown up in Queens, in a third-floor apartment above a laundromat, raised by her mother, Denise Brooks, who cleaned offices at night and kept a dictionary on the kitchen table because she believed every new word was a key. When Maya was 11, an elderly neighbor named Rosalia Greco moved into the apartment across the hall. Rosalia was from a village outside Palermo, though she always said Sicily first, Italy second. She cooked with the door open. She prayed in a language Maya had never heard. She called every child on the floor sweetheart, but she called Maya Pixarita, little one. After school, when Maya's mother was still at work, Rosalia taught her recipes, songs, family sayings, and the old Sicilian phrases that did not live in textbooks. A language is not just words, Rosalia used to say, tapping Maya gently on the hand with a wooden spoon. It is someone's home. And now, years later, in a room full of people planning to sell a version of heritage they could not feel, Maya had accidentally opened a door no money could build. Adrian finally found his voice, but it did not come out with the authority he expected. "Maya," he said, reading her name tag for the first time as if it had appeared out of nowhere. "What did you just say to my father?" The question sounded calm, but everyone at the table heard the crack beneath it. Maya turned toward him, still holding the quiet posture of someone trained to take up as little space as possible. "I said, the one who carries the sun inside is never truly alone." Salvatore closed his eyes. His hand pressed over the little golden sun stitched into the handkerchief, and the tears he had tried to hide slipped down the deep lines of his face. Adrian stared at him, stunned by the softness of a man he had spent years misunderstanding. To Adrian, his father had always been the man who kept old receipts in coffee tins, saved rubber bands around envelopes, and told the same stories about Sicily until Adrian stopped listening. He remembered being a boy in Brooklyn, embarrassed when Salvatore spoke too loudly at parent conferences, embarrassed when other children asked why his lunch smelled like garlic and anchovies, embarrassed when his father kissed his forehead in public and called him figlio mio in front of boys with cleaner sneakers and bigger houses. Adrian had spent his whole adult life escaping that little apartment above the bakery. He changed his last name from Bellini to Whitmore after business school because Whitmore sounded smoother on a letterhead, easier for investors to pronounce, less tied to flour-dusted hands and an old country accent. He told himself it was branding. He told himself every empire needed a name people could trust. What he never admitted was that he had mistaken distance for success. Across the table, Victoria sensed the mood slipping away from her control. She placed one perfect hand over Adrian's sleeve and smiled at Maya with the kind of politeness that wears gloves. "That is very sweet," she said. "But I am sure Mr. Bellini is just surprised. This has been a long evening." Salvatore opened his eyes. The room felt colder after that. He looked at Victoria, then at Adrian, then back at Maya. "Where did you learn those words?" he asked, his English thick with emotion. Maya swallowed. Every eye was on her now, and attention had never felt like safety. "From Mrs. Rosalia Greco," she said. "She lived across the hall from me when I was a child. She taught me after school while my mother worked nights." Salvatore's face changed so suddenly that Adrian leaned forward. Not shock this time. Recognition. Fear of hope. "Rosalia Greco," Salvatore repeated, each syllable careful, like he was touching something fragile. "From Palermo?" Maya nodded slowly. "Near Palermo. She said she left Sicily when she was young. She kept letters tied with blue ribbon. Some had the same sun on them." The silence returned, but now it had weight. Not the stunned silence of wealthy people watching an awkward scene. A deeper silence. The kind that arrives when the past walks into the room without asking permission. One of the investors shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Another checked his watch, then stopped when Adrian looked at him. Even Victoria stopped smiling. Salvatore reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small black and white photograph, worn soft at the edges. He slid it across the table with a shaking hand. The picture showed two young girls standing in front of a stone house, one holding a basket, the other squinting into the Sicilian sun. "My mother," he whispered, tapping one face. Then he tapped the other. "Her little sister, Rosalia. She disappeared from our family after the war. My mother waited for a letter until the day she died." Maya looked down at the photograph, and all the air seemed to leave her chest. The woman in the picture was younger, brighter, untouched by age, but the eyes were the same eyes that had watched Maya do homework at a tiny kitchen table in Queens. The same eyes that had filled with tears whenever old songs played on the radio. The same eyes that had once told Maya, "Some families are not lost forever. Sometimes they are only waiting for the right voice to call them back." For the first time that night, Adrian Whitmore looked smaller than his own chair. The table that had been arranged to honor him, the candles, the crystal, the imported wine, the discreet security by the doors, all of it seemed to pull away from him as his father sat staring at a waitress from Queens who somehow carried the missing chapter of their family. Maya wanted to step back. She wanted to return to the safe rhythm of service, water on the left, plates cleared from the right, smile only when necessary, disappear before anyone decided her presence was too much. But Salvatore was still looking at her like she had brought a light into a room he had kept dark for 50 years. "She is alive?" he asked, his voice barely more than air. Maya's throat tightened. "She passed away 3 years ago," she said softly. The words landed gently, but they still changed his face. Salvatore did not break down. He did not make a scene. He simply lowered his eyes, and the grief moved through him with the quiet dignity of an old church bell. Adrian watched his father absorb the news and realized, with a sudden shame that burned colder than anger, that he did not know enough about him to understand what had just been lost. He knew the numbers in his father's retirement account. He knew which doctors to call. He knew the address of the assisted living residence he had once suggested too casually. But he did not know the name Rosalia. He did not know there had been letters tied with blue ribbon. He did not know his grandmother had died waiting for a sister who had been living 40 minutes away by subway, raising other people's children with old songs and a wooden spoon. Victoria cleared her throat, delicate and sharp. "This is deeply moving," she said, though her eyes were already scanning the investors. "But perhaps this is a private family matter. Adrian, the announcement is scheduled for 9 o'clock. There it was. The clock, the money, the performance trying to reclaim the room. One of the city consultants nodded quickly. "We have press outside in 20 minutes, he said. "The preservation objections are already delicate. We really should keep the evening focused." Salvatore lifted his head. Preservation objections? The phrase sounded strange in his mouth, almost insulting. Adrian looked at the consultant, silently warning him not to continue, but the damage had already opened a door. Maya felt it too. She had served enough private dinners to understand when truth was being hidden under expensive language. Salvatore turned to his son. What objections? Adrian inhaled slowly. The man who could explain a billion-dollar acquisition in 4 clean sentences suddenly could not explain this. There are a few community groups concerned about the development footprint, he said. Development footprint. Maya looked toward the windows facing Mulberry Street, where old awnings fluttered in the cold March wind, and a bakery sign glowed red across the block. Salvatore followed her gaze. His eyes moved from the street to the framed photographs on the wall, to the painted golden sun above the kitchen arch, to the proposal packet near Adrian's plate with the words Bellini Tower stamped across the front in elegant black letters. He understood before anyone explained. The silence sharpened. Bellini Tower, Salvatore whispered. You put our name on this. Adrian said nothing. That was answer enough. Salvatore's hand closed slowly around the old photograph. My father sold bread on that corner, he said. Your grandmother cleaned rooms 2 streets from here. I washed dishes in a basement kitchen until my hands cracked every winter. This place was not beautiful because it was rich. It was beautiful because people survived here. No one at the table moved. Maya stood beside him, still holding the edge of her serving tray, feeling the room tilt towards something larger than embarrassment. This was no longer about a surprising language. It was about what people choose to honor and what they choose to erase. Adrian looked at the proposal, then at his father, then at Maya. For the first time all night, he did not look like a billionaire deciding the future. He looked like a son realizing he had almost sold the past. The proposal packet lay beside Adrian's plate like evidence no one wanted to touch. A few minutes earlier, it had looked elegant, heavy, inevitable. Now the black letters on the cover seemed almost cruel. Bellini Tower. A family name printed on a plan to remove the very streets that had once protected that family when America did not know what to do with them. Adrian reached for the packet, but Salvatore placed his hand over it first. The old man did not slam it. He did not raise his voice. That made it worse. Tell me, Salvatore said, which buildings? Adrian's jaw tightened. He looked toward the attorneys, then toward the investors, as if one of them might rescue him with language polished enough to soften the truth. No one did. Money is loud when it is winning, but it becomes very quiet when conscience enters the room. Finally, the city consultant opened a tablet and turned the screen toward Salvatore. A bright digital map appeared, glowing blue and gold beneath the chandelier light. 6 blocks were outlined in red. The bakery across the street. The church basement where immigrant families still held Sunday suppers. The old grocery with tomatoes stacked in wooden crates every summer. The community language center above the tailor shop. The narrow apartment building where Rosalia Greco had lived for 19 years before moving to Queens. Maya saw it and felt her stomach drop. She had walked those stairs. She had carried soup to Rosalia during winter storms. She had sat at that tiny kitchen table while Rosalia unfolded letters that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. That building, Maya said before she could stop herself. Every face turned to her again. Graham Pierce, the restaurant manager, stepped forward quickly, his smile tight with panic. Maya, thank you. That will be all for now. It was the old command dressed in manners. Step back. Be small. Return to the corner where your silence makes everyone comfortable. Maya lowered her tray, but she did not leave. Her hands were steady, though her heart was not. Mrs. Greco lived in one of those buildings, she said. 4th floor. No elevator. Green door. She used to say the stairs kept her young, even when her knees disagreed. Salvatore turned to her with fresh pain in his eyes. You knew her there? Yes, sir. Before she moved near my mother. Before she got sick. Victoria exhaled softly, almost impatiently. This is unfortunate, of course, but Adrian cannot redesign a $2 billion project because of sentimental details. Sentimental. The word floated above the table like perfume sprayed over smoke. Maya looked at her, not with anger, but with the kind of calm that makes arrogance feel exposed. Those details were people, she said. No one chuckled this time. Adrian's face changed when she said it. Just a little. Just enough. He had heard protesters say similar things in public hearings and had dismissed them as emotional resistance to progress. But coming from Maya, with his father's tears still wet on the tablecloth and Rosalia's name hanging between them, The sentence did not sound like resistance. It sounded like truth. One investor leaned forward, lowering his voice. Adrian, we respect the personal history, but we have commitments. If you delay tonight, the financing structure becomes complicated. Another added, the press release is already embargoed. Pulling back now sends the wrong signal. Salvatore looked at his son. And what signal does this send to your grandmother? Adrian flinched. Not visibly enough for the table to call it weakness, but Maya saw it. She had become very good at seeing small breaks in powerful men. Adrian stood slowly, buttoning his jacket out of habit, as if fabric could restore control. I need a moment, he said. But Salvatore shook his head. No, you have had years of moments. I am asking now. The room seemed to narrow around father and son. Chandeliers glittered. Wine breathed in crystal glasses. Outside, a yellow cab rolled past the windows on Mulberry Street, ordinary and unaware. Adrian looked down at the red blocks on the map. Then Maya reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, worn soft along the edges. Mrs. Greco gave me this before she passed, she said. She told me to keep it until I found someone who would understand the son. Salvatore stared at the envelope. His name was not on it. His mother's was. Maya held the envelope with both hands, as if paper could become sacred when it carried enough years inside it. The room did not breathe. Even Graham Pierce, who had built a career on interrupting uncomfortable moments before they reached wealthy tables, stood still near the service station with his mouth half open and no words ready. Salvatore looked at the name written across the front, and the color drained from his face. It was not his name. It was his mother's name, Lucia Bellini, written in blue ink that had faded almost to gray. The letters leaned slightly to the right, graceful and careful, the handwriting of someone who had written slowly because every word mattered. Adrian stared at it, but for once he did not reach first. He had reached first his whole life. First in meetings. First in negotiations. First for the clean version of every story. This time he stepped back. Salvatore took the envelope from Maya with hands that trembled so gently it made the table feel ashamed for watching. She kept this, he whispered. Maya nodded. She said she wrote it many times, but never knew where to send it. She told me some homes move, but love keeps the old address. Salvatore closed his eyes, and his thumb moved over his mother's name like a prayer. Then he opened the envelope. Inside was one folded sheet and a small pressed flower, dry and delicate, almost weightless. A yellow wildflower. The kind that grew along stone roads in Sicily. The kind Rosalia had once told Maya could survive without asking anyone's permission. Salvatore unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the first line, and his breath caught. The words were in Sicilian. Old Sicilian. Not the polished Italian of restaurants and travel ads, but the language of kitchens, ports, lullabies, and women calling children home before sunset. Salvatore tried to read, but emotion broke his voice before the first sentence was complete. Maya did not move until he looked at her. He did not ask with words. He did not need to. She stepped closer, careful, respectful, still a waitress in uniform, yet suddenly the only person in the room who could carry the past across the table. She read softly. Rosalia had written to her sister Lucia, apologizing for vanishing, explaining how fear, pride, and bad addresses had swallowed the years. She wrote about arriving in New York with one suitcase, about working in laundries and bakeries, about hearing Sicilian in the market and turning around too late. She wrote that she had searched church records, old neighborhoods, family names, but life kept moving her from one rented room to another. Then came the line that changed the air. If my sister is gone, tell her son that I remembered him every morning when the sun touched my window. Salvatore covered his mouth. Adrian looked away, but not before Maya saw his eyes shine. The investors shifted in their chairs, suddenly aware that their watches, cuff links, and projections had no language for this. Victoria stared at the letter as though it had betrayed her schedule. Maya kept reading. Rosalia had left one final request. If the Bellini family was ever found, they should protect the streets where their people had learned to become American without forgetting who they were. Not freeze them in the past. Not turn them into decoration. Protect them as living places, where children could hear old languages and still dream new dreams. The letter ended with the same sentence Maya had spoken moments earlier. The one who carries the sun inside is never truly alone. When Maya finished, No one clapped. No one whispered. Salvatore reached for her hand with the quiet permission of grief, and Maya gave it to him. He held it like a bridge. Then he looked at Adrian. Your tower would have buried her twice, he said. Adrian did not defend himself. That was the first honest thing he did all night. Adrian stood in the silence like a man hearing the true cost of his own success for the first time. The numbers were still there. $2 billion in projected value. Hundreds of luxury suites. A rooftop restaurant with skyline views. A private club with imported marble, valet service, and membership fees higher than Maya's yearly rent. The whole room had been built around those numbers, but now they looked thin beside one folded letter and an old man's broken heart. One investor cleared his throat, careful but firm. Adrian, I understand this is personal, but the board will not respond well to a motion-replacing strategy. The sentence was smooth. Practiced. Safe. It sounded like every boardroom excuse that had ever turned people into obstacles. Salvatore did not look at him. Maya did. She did not mean to, but her eyes moved to the man's face, and something in her quiet attention made him look down at his plate. Adrian noticed that. He noticed everything now, as if Maya's one sentence had changed the lighting in the room. He saw the servers standing near the wall, pretending not to listen. He saw the old photographs behind the investors, families who had crossed an ocean and built lives from flour, rent, prayer, and stubborn hope. He saw his father's hand resting over Rosalia's letter. And he saw Maya Brooks, still in uniform, still technically on the clock, standing with more dignity than anyone who had paid to sit at that table. Victoria leaned closer, her voice low enough to sound private, but sharp enough to cut. Do not let this become a spectacle. You can honor your father later. Tonight is about leadership. Adrian turned to her slowly. For years, people had praised him for leadership when what they really meant was control. Control the room. Control the story. Control the loss before anyone called it loss. But leadership, real leadership, suddenly looked different. It looked like stopping before the damage became permanent. It looked like listening when the person speaking had no title, no shares, no seat at the table. What would you suggest? Adrian asked her. Victoria relaxed, thinking the room had returned to familiar ground. Make a donation. Name the cultural lounge after Rosalia. Preserve one storefront as a heritage feature. People love that kind of thing. Salvatore closed his eyes. Maya felt the words land badly. A heritage feature. A small corner of memory preserved like decoration inside a building designed to erase the rest. Adrian glanced down at the proposal again. There was a rendering of the future lobby, all glass and cream stone, with a painted Sicilian sun above the concierge desk. A symbol taken from his family. A symbol Rosalia had protected in a drawer. A symbol Maya had recognized when his own eyes had passed over it without meaning. No, Adrian said. It was not loud, but it traveled. The consultant looked up. No to which part? Adrian placed his palm flat on the proposal. No to the announcement. The table shifted at once. Papers moved. Phones lit up. The investors began speaking over each other with calm panic. The kind powerful people use when losing money might still be prevented if everyone acts fast enough. Graham Pierce appeared near Adrian's shoulder, whispering that press had gathered near the private entrance. Adrian did not answer him. He looked at Maya instead. Mrs. Greco's building is inside the acquisition zone. Maya nodded. Yes, sir. And the language center? Yes, sir. Above the tailor shop. Salvatore opened his eyes. Adrian took the tablet from the consultant, turned it toward himself, and stared at the red outline as if seeing a wound he had drawn by hand. Then he did something no one expected. He deleted the keynote file from the screen in front of him. One tap, then another. The presentation vanished. The future everyone had come to celebrate disappeared into a blank display. Victoria's face went pale with disbelief. Adrian, think carefully. He looked at his father, then at Maya, then at the faces around the table waiting for the old version of him to return. But the old version had nothing left to say. I am thinking carefully, he said. Maybe for the first time tonight. The blank screen reflected Adrian's face back at him, pale beneath the private dining room lights, older than he had looked 20 minutes before. Around the table, panic dressed itself in professional language. One investor warned about penalties. Another mentioned market confidence. The city consultant whispered about permits, deadlines, and political commitments. Victoria sat perfectly still, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her napkin until the linen twisted in her hand. Adrian heard them all, yet none of their voices reached the place in him where the decision had already begun. For years, he had believed courage meant moving forward when others hesitated. Tonight, courage meant stopping while everyone powerful begged him not to. He looked toward the doors, where the press waited beyond a velvet rope, hungry for a clean story about legacy, luxury, and growth. They were expecting him to step out smiling, father beside him, fiancé on his arm, cameras flashing as he sold the city a dream polished enough to hide the people underneath it. Instead, Adrian picked up Rosalia's letter. He did not open it. He simply held it carefully, the way Maya had held it, as if it deserved more respect than any contract in the room. "My father once told me that America gave our family a second chance," he said. His voice was steady now, but softer. "I thought that meant building something bigger than what came before." Salvatore watched him without blinking. Maya stood near the table, unsure whether she should remain, but something in Adrian's expression asked her not to disappear. "I was wrong," Adrian continued. "A second chance does not mean erasing the first place that held you." The room fell quiet again, not from shock this time, but from the pressure of a powerful man saying something that could cost him. Victoria leaned in. "Adrian, do not do this emotionally." He turned to her. "No, I built the project emotionally. I just called it strategy." That sentence landed harder than any argument. Graham Pierce lowered his eyes. One of the attorneys closed his folder, already understanding that the evening had changed beyond repair. Then Salvatore pushed himself slowly to his feet. Adrian moved to help him, but Salvatore raised one hand, not rejecting him, only asking to stand on his own. He looked around at the investors, the consultants, the polished people who had spent the evening speaking about Little Sicily without listening to it. "My son has made many mistakes," Salvatore said. "So have I. I let him believe the past was something to escape because I was tired. Because I wanted him to have clean shoes, clean English, clean chances. But a tree without roots does not become free. It falls." Adrian's eyes shone, but he did not look away. Maya felt the words settle over the room like dust after a long-closed window had finally opened. Salvatore turned to her. "And this young woman, who none of you invited to speak, remembered what my own family forgot." Maya shook her head slightly, embarrassed by the attention. "I only repeated what Mrs. Greco taught me." "No," Salvatore said gently. "You honored it." Outside the dining room, a camera flash sparked through the frosted glass. The press was getting restless. Adrian looked at the doors, then at the people at the table. The old fear moved through him one last time. The fear of looking weak, foolish, sentimental, uncontrolled. Then he placed the proposal packet in the center of the table and closed it. "I am going outside," he said. "I am telling them the announcement is canceled. Effective tonight, Whitmore Capital is withdrawing the demolition plan. Tomorrow morning, we begin a preservation review with the community present, not spoken about from behind closed doors." The investors erupted in restrained objections, but Adrian raised one hand, and for the first time all evening, his authority sounded human instead of cold. "You can stay with me or leave the deal, but I will not put my family name on a building that buries my father's." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair whispering against the floor. "You are throwing away $2 billion because a waitress told you a sad story." Adrian looked at Maya, then back at Victoria. "No," he said. "I almost threw away my father because no one like her had been allowed to speak sooner." The doors opened, and the noise from the hallway rushed in like weather. Cameras lifted. Reporters straightened. Public relations staff froze with prepared smiles still hanging on their faces. They had expected Adrian Whitmore to walk out polished, victorious, untouched by doubt, the billionaire son beside the immigrant father, the perfect photograph for a city that loved heritage only after it had been priced correctly. But Adrian did not walk out that way. He walked slowly, with Salvatore on one side and Maya Brooks on the other, not hidden behind him, not trailing his service staff, but standing close enough that every camera had to choose whether to include her. For one brief second, the flashes stopped. The hallway seemed to question itself. Then every lens found the three of them. Victoria remained behind in the dining room, silent now, while the investors watched through the glass like men seeing a ship leave the dock without them. Adrian stepped to the small podium placed beneath the Bellini Tower display. The screen still showed the Golden Sun logo, sleek and expensive, stripped of its meaning until tonight. He looked at it, then looked at his father. Salvatore gave one small nod. It was not forgiveness yet. It was permission to begin. Adrian faced the cameras. "There will be no announcement for Bellini Tower tonight," he said. The hallway erupted in questions, but he raised his hand and waited until the noise folded back into silence. "The project, as currently designed, is canceled. Whitmore Capital will not proceed with a development that removes families, businesses, and cultural spaces from Little Sicily without the community having a true voice in what happens next." A reporter called out, asking what had changed. Adrian did not reach for the safe answer. He turned slightly toward Maya. "Someone I failed to see reminded me what the neighborhood already knew," he said. "History is not decoration. It is people." Maya felt heat rise in her face as the cameras shifted toward her. She wanted to disappear, but Salvatore gently touched her elbow, not to hold her in place, to remind her that she belonged there. Adrian continued, "Tomorrow morning, I will meet with local residents, preservation groups, small business owners, and language educators. We will create a new plan, and the first commitment is the Rosalia Greco Cultural Fund, dedicated to protecting immigrant stories, community language programs, and the families who kept these streets alive long before my company arrived." The name Rosalia moved through the hallway like a bell. Salvatore lowered his head. Maya thought of the tiny queen's kitchen, the wooden spoon, the pressed flowers, the old woman who had believed love could keep an address even when people were lost. Later, after the cameras, after the statements, after the investors left with tight faces and colder handshakes, the restaurant emptied into a softer kind of quiet. Chairs were tucked in. Candles burned low. Outside, Mulberry Street glistened under a thin spring rain, and the red bakery sign across the block still glowed like a heart refusing to go out. Adrian found Maya near the service station, folding in used napkins because her hands needed something ordinary to do. For the first time, he did not speak to her like a billionaire speaking to an employee. He spoke like a man who had been corrected and knew the correction had saved him. "Maya," he said, "I am sorry. Not only for tonight. For every room that made you feel invisible before you had to prove you were extraordinary." Maya looked at him for a long moment. "I was extraordinary before anyone noticed," she said softly. Adrian nodded, and this time he understood. Salvatore approached with Rosalia's letter held against his chest. "Tomorrow," he said to Maya, "will you show me where she lived?" Maya smiled, small but real. "Yes, sir. 4th floor. Green door." Salvatore's eyes filled again, but this time the tears did not look like grief alone. They looked like return. Adrian owned buildings, contracts, towers that could touch the clouds. Maya carried a sentence from an old woman in Queens. And that night, under the fading gold light of Bellafiore, everyone learned which one could bring a family home.